Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Mysterious Correspondent, New Stories, by Marcel Proust, translated by Charlotte Mandel, narrated by Simon Vance. Introduction, by Luc Fraisse, professor at the University of Strasbourg. It is not very often that one unearths stories written by Marcel Proust, stories that no one had ever heard of before. In 1978, Gallimard published the booklet L'Indifférent. It was discovered by Philip Kolb, editor of Proust's Correspondent, thanks to letters from a late 19th century newspaper. For a long time the text was forgotten, at least by readers, since the writer remembered it perfectly when much later he composed the Swan in Love section in Swan's Way, the first volume of In Search of Lost Time. The case is even more striking today, since it is a question of a whole series of stories composed at the same time as L'Indifférent, the time of pleasures and days, but that have not been published. Proust kept drafts of the manuscripts in his archives and didn't mention them to anyone, at least according to the various documents known to us today. What do these stories contain? Why did Proust not speak of them to anyone? And given his apparent interest in keeping them to himself, why were they even written? While all those enigmas cannot be resolved once and for all, one can learn something about them through their subject matter, since almost all these texts deal with the question of homosexuality. Some, like texts already known, transpose the question Proust is concerned with into female homosexuality. Others have no transposition. No doubt their young author chose to keep these revealing stories, which were probably too scandalous at the time, secret. But he did feel the need to write them. They comprise, hiding in plain sight, the private diary the writer entrusted to no one. What could have caused a scandal in Proust's time, in relation to his family milieu, in relation to his society, is the very fact of homosexuality. For these stories contain nothing obscene, nothing that would give rise to voyeurism. They explore, by extraordinarily varied paths, as we will see, the psychological and moral subject of homosexuality. They essentially reveal a psychology of suffering. They do not invite us to intrude on Proust's private life. Rather, they lead us to understand a human experience. Coming from the archives compiled by Bernard de Fallois, who died in January 2018, these stories require a little history to shed light on why they have waited so long for publication, and in what context Proust wrote or drafted them, then once and for all removed them from the public gaze and even from his own close confidants. There was a time, now long forgotten, when if one looked at Marcel Proust's literary fate, one could be forgiven for thinking that this writer had lived a life that was essentially split in half. A youth spent in the salons, flower in his buttonhole, and an adulthood devoted to the single-minded writing of a vast work whose completion he barely had time to glimpse in the distance when he died at the age of 51. Marcel Proust, the author of In Search of Lost Time, that great monument of French literature, that work of worldwide heritage. His contemporaries realized his importance as the successive volumes appeared, culminating in the last books in 1927. But evaluating the magnitude of the cycle of novels was left till later, since it was too immense and too rich to be assimilated right away. Whatever the case, its author had died while still working on it, at the same age as Balzac, and for much the same reasons. Wasn't it inconsiderate, the thinking went, that Proust chose to wait for the beginning of his physical decline before he settled down to this superhuman literary undertaking, writing almost nothing, like the hero of In Search of Lost Time, up to Time Regained? Without In Search of Lost Time, what would Marcel Proust amount to? A minor work from his youth, Pleasures and Days, published at the end of the 19th century, leaving it to us to turn the page of the 20th century to see the literary genius of his magnum opus suddenly appear. a few translations of Ruskin, not unconnected to the masterwork that would follow, since they centred on cathedrals and on reading. But nothing more. One uneven book, one writer as translator. This school of thought began to shift in the middle of the century. In 1949, André Maurois published, with Hachette, a book called In Search of Marcel Proust, which let us breathe the atmosphere in which the novelist evolved through his great work. From Correspondence, the biographer drew statements suggesting that this last-minute miracle writer of literature had been, all the while, constantly concerned with writing. Maurois met a young graduate student, Bernard de Fallois, who wanted to write, if the Faculté de Paris accepted him, a thesis devoted to Proust, and in the wake of his own research, Maurois introduced Fallois to the writer's niece, Suzy Montet-Proust, devoted, like her late father, to Proust's heritage. Even before opening the family archives, and later on searching through the wealth of sales catalogues, Bernard de Fallois was sceptical when faced with the widely accepted idea that Proust had somehow composed a monument of literature all of a sudden, after emerging from a uniquely idle youth. Already the works that preceded In Search of Lost Time, far from insignificant, were enough to suggest a constant progression in Proust of pre-Proust, particularly when one considered his other creative influences. This leads us to suppose that the salon habitué was nothing like Charles Swann, but devoted himself rather to intense questionings about what he could write. In this light, the writings that came before In Search, from Pleasures and Days, 1896, to Proust's translations of Ruskin's The Bible of Amiens, 1904, and Sesame and Lilies, 1906, should not be viewed as the dregs of the great work, but rather as harbouring an abundance of literary experimentations. These books are laboratories. The texts palpitate like matter in fusion. Their dates, however, are very far apart, leading us to imagine that the developing writer interrupted his researches and interrogations, continually putting them off till another year, and resuming if and when the opportunity presented itself. Between these well-known works that we already knew about, there is a void that is certainly due not to the creator's inactivity, but to our own ignorance. The Proust family archives were only deposited at the Bibliothèque Nationale in 1962. In the hands of Bernard de Fallois, a methodical researcher with an archivist's perseverance, previously unknown papers, which soon added up to a considerable collection, came to light. Fallois pieced together a large novel in separate parts, paradoxically written in the third person, though it was so close to the author's biography, the sections of which could be classified by following the chronology of the life of the character who would give the collection its title, Jean Saint-Oeil. This large reconstructed novel, published by Gallimard in 1952, contained a preface by André Maurois. The letters and papers around it show that it was composed mainly between 1895 and 1899. Far from falling back into inertia, Proust had settled down to a large novel at a time when Pleasures and Days hadn't even been published yet. This long and ultimately unfinished new novel was, in fact, composed immediately after the completion of Pleasures and Days, and was apparently written without respite, as evidenced by the dates noted on the chronologically labelled texts. Jean Saint-Oeil, then, was the bridge between Pleasures and Days and John Ruskin. But now other manuscripts, other notebooks were beginning to appear. They could be placed at the threshold of In Search, around 1908, and they revealed that this novelistic cycle was born at the same time as an essay by Proust, polemical but philosophically well argued, against Sainte-Beuve's biographical methods. Proust sometimes thought about detaching this essay from his rough drafts and publishing it separately. But the reality of these drafts was quite different. It was an essay and a novel at the same time. This hybrid composition challenged the usual critical classifications, but it didn't bother Bernard de Fallois in the least. He had already reinterpreted Pleasures and Days, the book Proust didn't like because it wasn't in search and because all pieces within it are disparate, as an ensemble that was, on the contrary, coherent, rich, and varied. All the pieces in it hold together. Each one is necessary and prepares the way for the next thing. Thus the one who discovered new books by Proust was not bothered by this essay of literary theory turning into a novel, where a well-ordered refutation of Sainte-Beuve is mingled with the Guermantes' thoughts on the novels of Balzac. Fallois published this collection, not rearranged by prejudices of reading, in 1954, under the title, suggested by Proust in his letters of the time, Against Sainte-Beuve. What a paradox, Fallois would later point out, to reveal this little book of Proust's against the biographical critic at a time when contemporary scholars were just beginning to become interested in Proust precisely from a biographical perspective. On the other hand, the time was well chosen, since during the same years the reign of literary history, which approached criticism by restoring writers to their contemporary circumstances, what they read, their milieu, the literary schools of the time, and all the circumstances of their lives, was beginning its decline, challenged by a school that demanded a reading of the works by themselves for their internal structure. What a blessing to receive Marcel Proust's caution against biography! While he himself didn't subscribe wholly to this theory, Bernard de Fallois would retain the main lesson of the essay he revealed to the public. In his 7 lectures on Marcel Proust, he asks, "Is Proust's life as interesting as all that?" And his reply was a definite no. The pioneer of Proust studies pursued his task, which would become his thesis. If the university allowed it, the subject of his thesis would be Proust's creative evolution up to In Search of Lost Time. This thesis never saw the light of day, and was abandoned after the 2 major publications of Proust's works that opened up the publishing world to their discoverer. 2 sections were eventually completely rewritten and were read by Bernard de Fallois' intellectual peers. While the first part is apparently lost, the second part, which, alas, has become secondary, constitutes an entirely autonomous essay that Les Belles Lettres published under the title Proust avant Proust. A scholarly essay, but one in which science is subsumed by intellectual attentiveness, as a thesis ideally should be, as those theses are that go on to become perennially fashionable books. An essay whose striking originality and novelty have not been dulled by having been neglected for 2 generations before being brought to our knowledge today. Fallois' exploration of pleasures and days was nourished by these ample archives, whose nuances the classifier handled like organ stops. Like Proust, the detractor of Sainte-Beuve, and even paradoxically like Sainte-Beuve in fact, Fallois knew that the author's biography should not be absent from our reading of his works. But it should be an inner biography, which the best contemporaries of Proust called a psychological biography. One must know how to glimpse, in the seeming randomness of circumstances that have been lived through, the enriching perspective of structures as they emerge. It is this structural gaze that Bernard de Fallois brings to bear on the seemingly disparate pieces gathered together in Pleasures and Days. What becomes clear from this retrospective study is one single search, one literary attempt, what might be called a young writer's search for his voice, a search that is so difficult to carry out that one must take many different paths to be able to reach one single goal. Fallois pushed clairvoyance to the point of not only identifying what, in Proust's youthful writings, prepared the still remote In Search of Lost Time, but also noting a number of stances that we would never see again in Proust's later writings, because this never again, this one time only, teaches us much about the development of a Proust who has reached his full maturity. As the essayist was pondering the long-term development of the writer's style and thought processes while he was indexing and classifying the archives, he encountered fluttering around Pleasures and Days handwritten pages that were not part of the 1896 collection and were not published in journals of the time. Some of them appeared named in handwritten tables of contents he came across, with an eye to this very book, which Proust first called Le Château de Réveillon, in reference to Madame de Mer's manor house in the Marne, where some of these texts were composed in close collaboration with Reynaldo Hahn. These were pieces that Proust moved around, added to, or removed in much the same way Guillaume Apollinaire did when he put together his poetry collection Alcool in 1912. These prose texts on separate pieces of paper were all short stories. Written at the same time as the ones in Pleasures and Days with which we are familiar, they inevitably share some similarities. But taken individually, since the author withheld them from publication, they also have a further significance as a series of unpublished pieces. Part of Bernard de Fallois' essay speaks about this specific question. Jean-Claude Casanova wisely pre-published this part in number 163 of the literary journal Commentaire in the autumn of 2018 under the title Le Secret et l'Aveu, The Secret and the Confession. For that is the crux of the thing. But what crux, precisely? The writings that Proust left in the margins or set aside while he was preparing his collection, Pleasures and Days, imply that it could have been a much larger book. But if its young author had included all the texts that we are reproducing here in their finished form, the portrayal of homosexuality would have become the main subject of the book. Proust did not want this, no doubt fearing questions this might raise over his own sexuality, questions that a modern-day reader has long been able to answer. Perhaps some of these texts were of greater personal significance than of public value. Perhaps, too, the writer wanted to preserve a more deliberate diversity within his collection. Finally, he may have doubted the quality and the literary success of these texts that he ended up setting aside. Proust, as a young man and a young writer, viewed homosexuality as a curse and cause of much suffering. This cannot be dismissed as merely symptomatic of mainstream opinion at the time. After all, Proust's position was entirely opposed to that of his contemporary, André Gide, hedonist and egotist, who did not embrace such an avowal of Proustian tragedy, but on the contrary associated homosexuality with vitalist happiness. Whence also arose another contrast between a Proust torn between secrecy and disclosure, working out an elaborate system of transpositions, and a Gide who insisted on saying "I," to such an extent that he noted in his journal, after a visit to Proust in 1921, "When I say a word or two about my memoirs, you can tell anything," Proust exclaims, "but on condition that you never say I. But that won't suit me." Proust then would never say I in such a context, but the story of the captain, a captain's reminiscence, narrated in the first person, is the one that comes closest to a direct personal utterance. In these discarded stories we see as never before a whole series of projections being elaborated, of discourse by proxy. The drama would be played out between two women, and although the narrator appears to be on the side of the innocent woman, the story draws no facile distinction between guilt and innocence. The crucial drama of adolescence is transposed into a premature end of life, an apocalypse in the double sense of a revelation of the end of days for the character, and also in the act of revealing implied in the Greek word apokalaptein. The suffering of being condemned to not being loved by the person one loves is transposed into a musical universe, after Beethoven's Eighth Symphony. Suffering is also transposed into the situation of a heroine who knows she is condemned to her disease, but who decides to live out her agony with insouciance, Pauline de S. Suffering is externalized as a cat squirrel that accompanies the man at his home and outside in society, unbeknownst to anyone, the awareness of loving her. Finally, suffering can even be reassigned as a gift of the fairies. But transposition, when it bears such a heavy personal and emotional weight, is not easy. The narrator to whom Proust delegates the action of the story gets mixed up in it. We will see how the roles of Françoise and Christiane are confused and interchanged in the manuscript of The Mysterious Correspondent. The gift of the fairies, which is to accept suffering in exchange for the gift of experiencing real emotions, is accepted with more resignation than conviction. The secret animal, destined to accompany the unrequited lover of the awareness of loving her throughout his life, brings the subject a consolation that does not erase the failure. The contradiction is not resolved. Christian morality, Catholic in this instance, weighs heavily on these explorations in a way that is absent from Proust's later work. What we read in Pleasures and Days, as the collection was published, reduces religious concern to a superficial whiff of mysticism surrounded by a halo of decadent fin de siècle melancholy. These discarded stories, on the other hand, are more insistent. Christiane is going to die from consumption for having silently burned with love for her friend Françoise. Françoise asks if giving in to Christiane's desire would save her. Her confessor replies that it would mean causing the dying woman, who has been presented to the priest as a dying man, to lose by one deed the sacrifice of an entire life in order to fulfill some ideal of purity. The two positions are radically opposed. In terms of absolute value, neither of the two possibilities is invalidated. The young author of these stories will never again utter with the same insistence this memento mori of classical sermons. He will no longer take God to task as creator, except through images portraying artistic creation, to ask him why. Here the suffering character, isolated from the world of love, utters a very personal, "My kingdom is not of this world." He wonders where he can find for himself that promise of peace on earth to men of good will. The dialogue of the dead in the underworld distances the distressing closeness of all these questions, but the ancient patina of the underworld does not erase the perspective of hell or Christian damnation, which one of the protagonists tries to ward off by calling poetry, and thus poets, felix culpa, "O happy fault," the phrase used in a hymn to describe original sin. The doctor characters, halfway between Adrien Proust, the writer's father, and the future Docteur de Bourbon, fictional doctor of In Search, take over to open a possible way towards what Bergson, after Proust's death, would call the two sources of morality and religion. Christiane's doctor, by emphasizing that his patient is dying from a kind of consumption that does not stem from any organic cause, anticipates Freud visiting Jean-Martin Charcot at La Salpêtrière and preparing his Studies on Hysteria. A captain's reminiscence suggests the case of a character who is unaware of his own homosexuality, even as he describes it in a story where it will never be named outright. After Beethoven's Eighth Symphony, meditates on the relationship between an asthmatic's breathing and the occupation of space. But homosexual psychology, or homosexuality seen from within, whether directly or transposed, does not even remotely constitute the sole concern of these stories. In these stories we can see the writer at a time when his literary undertaking, which would continue to take shape up to In Search, was beginning. The student of philosophy is not far off. He is, in fact, quite contemporary with the writer. The consolation for not being loved, projected into a musical universe after Beethoven's Eighth Symphony, seems already nourished by the metaphysics of Schopenhauer's music. The captain, in his laborious reminiscence, repeats the very Fichtean distinction of the self and non-self, and his still clumsy questioning about the recreation of the past in his thinking is not without great promise, very like the search for a definition of essence. These reminders of Proust's philosophical erudition are already discreet. The mature Proust of In Search will find a way to enrich his prose with them without making them over-evident. As we might expect, some of the annotations here give us a fleeting insight into what would eventually form the basis of major episodes in the still remote In Search of Lost Time. Here we will see the role of literature appear in the resurrection of characters, the mediation of Botticelli in the apprehension of the beloved, the two lines by Alfred de Vigny that will serve as epigraph to Sodom and Gomorrah in the underworld. Perhaps the anticipated explanation of Saint-Loup's cold salute at the end of the Dancière episode in Guermantes' Way, a first version of the great controversy about homosexuality between Charlus and Richaud, here Caylus and Renan, in dialogue in the Underworld, in The Captive, but also what the Docteur de Bourbon's tirade in The Guermantes' Way on the pathologies of creative genius will one day answer. A first version of the solitary promenade in the Bois de Boulogne that will one day serve as the closing scene in Swann's Way, Jacques Lefeld, as well as an early version of the episode of the new writer in The Gourmand's Way, and the etymology of the rhetorical exclamation, "Trees, you have nothing more to say to me," at the heart of Time Regained. The reader can make out traces of the budding writer's own literary preferences here, Racine's Phèdre and Victor Hugo's Olympia's Sadness, perhaps Stendhal in Jacques Lefeld, and Dumas Père in the Underworld. Much of the world of Edgar Allan Poe, between the lines, as we'll see, and in this realm the reminiscences of Gérard de Nerval, and the novels of Tolstoy, whose influence would become more remote after Jean Saintoy. For the writing of these stories allows us a glimpse of the young writer experimenting with literary forms that he will set aside before maturing in his craft. The unresolved story, the fantastic tale, the dialogue of the dead. More precisely, it is interesting to note how borrowing freely from the forms of parable, apologue, and fairy tale here allows the novelist in training to pick and choose those forms he will retain, and those he will set aside as he develops his own style. Proust borrowed especially from the society novel, whose underlying current is not emphasized enough in the atmosphere of In Search of Lost Time, and which is made up of swift microcosms in several of his stories, especially the lovers meeting in the context of high society, with its resources, but especially its obstacles. This society novel, with its concentrated atmosphere, makes economical use of his long study of the novelistic arsenal even within a lengthy novel, but more appropriately at the service of the brevity of a short story. This world of salons, maître d's, excursions, fiacres, this will be Swann's world. Proust will discover this universe in the novel of his friend Georges de Loris, Ginette Châtenay, which Proust read in manuscript form from 1908 to 1909 and which was subsequently published in 1910, and portrays a heroine who is reading Pleasures and Days. The circle is closed. So many stages of learning and experimentation separate the young writer of these stories from the novelist of In Search that we might expect to find nothing of the latter in this novitiate. From that point of view, it is interesting to isolate precisely what we can already detect in these stories. For instance, here we find the very first versions of the future rift between time lost and time regained, which here are called frivolity and profundity, scatteredness and inwardness, appearance and reality. This rift would soon be explored more deeply in Jean Saintoy. But even then it will not be thought of as a structuring divide, and this large novel that followed the short stories will fail because it was unable to expound on this idea in a structurally meaningful way. These stories also witness the birth of the narrator of In Search in his capacity to see through appearances, to recognize, as the ever-present La Bruyère in Pleasures and Days would say, the man we do not see through the man we see, to which we can attribute the cheerfulness of a dying woman, the inexplicable tuberculosis of another, the sad, anguished memory of a captain, the solitary, repetitive strolls of a writer at the same time every day in the Bois. In the perpetually changing universe of a writer, phrases also have their history, or rather their own genesis and development. Some far-off day the stamp of authenticity will condense a famous passage from Time Regained. It was in an unpublished story from his youth that Proust saw this resource born from his pen. We may think that some of these stories were not successful because their author hesitated and couldn't decide among several possibilities. Take the captain, for instance. At first he appears to remember the past perfectly well, but in the very next sentence he can't manage to recall the corporal who had so moved him many years ago. Elsewhere we'll see direct dialogue and narrative analysis clash over the subject of the story, without either of the two forms managing to take precedence. These hesitations were, in fact, fertile, for these contradictions were all temporary. We who can today read not only In Search of Lost Time, but also the notebooks in which it was drafted, we know that the novelist would proceed in this way, juxtaposing on the same page a situation in the story and its opposite, because he wanted to experiment with the impact of each, its implications, and the analysis it could give rise to. The notebooks of The Fugitive are significant for this issue. It is here that we read that Albertine knew, but did not really know, Mademoiselle Vinteuil and her friend, that she had, but perhaps actually she hadn't, had relations with Andrea. The hero does not at all want to know with whom Gilberte used to walk up the Champs-Élysées, and yet he asks her. The writer of In Search, who would weigh all the potentialities...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?